Sauti Yetu Center for African Women was founded by our executive director, Zainab Yega, in 2004, so we're about to be 10 years old. Sauti Yetu is Swahili for Our Voices. We're a multi-service community organization dedicated to mobilizing African immigrant women to improve the quality of their lives, strengthen their communities, and develop their families. Actually, the reverse. Strengthen their families and develop their communities. Sauti Yetu's direct services, public education, and advocacy promotes immigrant girls' safe transitions into adulthood, curbs violence in the families, and gives poor and low-income immigrant women access to life skills and leadership opportunities. And I think what's really important to this and very germane to this report is that most of the work that we do comes out of, we can pinpoint the story or the experience that brought us to our way of doing that particular work. And I'll talk more about how we got into the issue of early and forced marriage in a bit. Sauti Yetu has 4 main programs, and then there's lots of work that falls in and out of those programs. But mainly our oldest program is our Violence Against Women and Girls program, and that mainly was focused on family violence, domestic violence, and sexual violence experienced by women and girls in our communities in New York City. Our African Girls Empowerment program, which is GELI, and focuses on adolescent African immigrant girls. And we chose to focus on adolescent girls because we found that first of all, they were the group that the community often said, well, what are we going to do about these girls? And they would come to us and tell us to do something about these girls. But also because there's such a narrow window of time between where they are and where they'll need to be in terms of their own self-sufficiency and their own independence into adulthood. And so we started the program mainly to serve that population of youth. Our Child and Family Services program is our newest program. It's our contract with the Administration for Children's Services in New York City, and we provide services to families that are experiencing some sort of crisis in some way or may be at risk for engaging the child welfare system. And finally, our work that we do to prevent female genital cutting, but also to make sure that women and girls who've already experienced the practice have access to quality health care and quality supports. And so those are our main programs and services as an agency, and we have several projects that fall that are kind of projects that come up because an issue has come up, but they don't qualify as a program per se. So GELI, which is our girls program, was founded, and I came on to the organization to start the program in 2006. So we're about 7 years old. And what we do is we provide academic and social support to immigrant girls that are 14 to 21 years old. And again, that came out of a call in the community for something for these girls and trying to deal with some of the challenges that girls were facing. And what we did when we first started is we went and spoke to girls. We did focus groups with girls in various parts of our communities. And we said, if we were to do something for you, what would that look like? And the thing that they said the most was academic support, which is a big part of what the program does. We're a school-based program that provides literacy support for kids primarily who have limited formal education, either didn't go to school before they arrived in the U.S. or had very limited schooling before they arrived in the U.S. And then were questions that we kind of put under the umbrella of leadership, and they were issues of cultural negotiation. How do you engage your different communities that you belong in? How do you feel like you're heard, and how are you able to figure out ways to use your voice? And so that's what we call our leadership work, and for us, leadership kind of encompasses all of those things.
Can I ask a quick question? I'm just curious about the girls that you're working with. Have most of them been born overseas and then are coming to the United States, or do you also work with people that are first or second generation having been born here, but their parents immigrated?
Most of our girls were born in West Africa and immigrated here as early teens or teenagers. Okay. We're starting to see more of our what folks call second generation youth who were born in the U.S. to mostly West African parents. Okay. But most of our girls have been in the country when they come to our program as early as a day or two, and is probably on average about a year or two before we meet them. Okay. Thanks. And so the issues of early and forced marriage have really come out of our work with GELI and also with the Child and Family Services program. And you'll see the very different ways that they come up. For For Gelly, it tends to come, we meet a girl first, we get to know her, and then we learn that this is an issue she's dealing with. With our Child and Family Services program, it may be either a presenting issue that comes in either through the referral from another agency, or it may not be a presenting issue. There may be other issues in the family, other forms of abuse, and then this issue kind of comes up out of nowhere, and then we're called in to deal with it. So just to kind of introduce you again to what we've done. So when we first, we had done the focus groups, and we decided that we were going to pilot the program the summer of 2007. We started out with a group in our conference room in our office, and when we did that group, we had 10 girls come regularly for 8 weeks. Of those 10 girls, 9 were married. Of those 9, there were 7 different versions of marriage. So what was telling in this is, one, I've been doing youth work probably prior to that about 10 years and had not encountered this issue. And growing up in a West African immigrant family and community hadn't encountered this issue. And so this was new to me. And so I think out of ignorance, I just asked very direct questions that maybe was a good thing, that I didn't feel, I didn't know better. So I asked very direct and very personal questions and learned that while 9 of them were married, 7 of them had different versions of that marriage. So some kids lived with their partners and were married and were carrying on as husband and wife, and then would go to school during the day and then come home and have the responsibilities of a wife. Other girls were engaged but didn't have a word in their language for what it meant to be engaged, so they just were deemed marriage. Other girls had been betrothed to someone at a very, very young age. They hadn't quite solidified the marriage yet, but they knew they were to be married, and they knew who that person was going to be. And others had worked out arrangements in the marriage contract that allowed them to stay with their parents while they finished school, and then they would go and live with their husband upon graduation. So there were all of those configurations happening under the umbrella of the word married. Mm-hmm. And so what that meant to us was that there was a lot more we needed to learn, and that we couldn't come to the table with very many assumptions about what it meant.
Were the girls in this group, were some of them still in high school and some were in college? Was it a variety, or?
9 were in high school and 1 was in middle school.
Oh, in middle school, okay.
Yeah. So and that was the one that was not married, but all the rest were in high school. And the other thing that we learned is that as we transitioned, as we said, okay, we've worked with these 10 girls over the summer, we want to continue to work with them. What's the best way to work with them? Mm-hmm. And we found that domestic responsibilities made it really impossible for them to stay after school. Mm-hmm. We had to contact the school to say, we need to figure out if we can do this in your space. Mm-hmm. And when we got to the space, we found that the schools had no idea that these girls were married. Mm-hmm. And that was the other important piece of information, mm-hmm. Is that this was not being disclosed. Mm-hmm. And so if there were access to resources, they weren't accessing them because there was no one to make those referrals. There was no one that knew the system in New York City well enough to be able to help them navigate it, mm-hmm. If they needed services and needed access to that. And so I think that was really the tip of the iceberg for us. And then as we began to work, we found that about 40% of our girls have disclosed to us already that they're either engaged or they're married. And we know that the number is higher, they just haven't disclosed yet.
Does it take a while before trust is built up and they're willing to disclose? Is that what you're finding in the work that you're doing?
We work in a few different school communities, and in some of the school communities, it's pretty much, actually that first school, once we began to make the school aware of the issue, girls began to come out of the closet all over the place. And so in that particular school, it isn't as hush-hush. The school tends to know now. The girls disclose. It's not something that they hide. While in other places that we've worked, we found that it's actually something that they still aren't disclosing. They aren't telling people. And so, yeah.
We're getting a couple questions, but if you don't mind, I'd just love to stop and take some of those. Mm-hmm. We had one participant asking if you found differences in the definition of marriage between, like, say, if there was a legal marriage versus a traditional marriage. Were the girls distinguishing this? Was it the case that maybe there was one but not the other?
Only one of the girls in that group had a marriage certificate and could put her finger on it and where it was. So they weren't making the distinction between legal and traditional marriage. Marriage was marriage to them. If you had to categorize their marriage was definitely traditional, maybe religious, and that was the marriage that was important to them. Most of them did not have a marriage certificate.
Okay.
At least in the U.S. One or two of those girls had been married abroad, and they probably did have a marriage certificate from where they were married, but none of them had a U.S. issued marriage certificate, and most of them were married here in the U.S.
And another participant was asking how the schools reacted when they found out about the girls being married.
We were fortunate because we asked the girls when we went to the girls and said, we want to do this program in your school, who should we talk to? They directed us to the people they trusted the most. And while that person didn't know that the girls were married, they knew the girls well enough where they thought, oh, that makes sense.
Okay.
It kind of was like, oh, okay. As the information trickled out to other members of the staff and the faculty, there was a lot of shock. There was a lot of kind of indignant, kind of how could this be sort of questions, and I think not knowing what to do, because it feels like something that's urgent, but the way it's lived in the girls' lives, it isn't necessarily, at least in the communities that we work in. So there were lots of questions of what do we do next, and because a lot of the girls were already married and there weren't any other pressing underlying issues, it was kind of like, well, not much right now. We hadn't really begun to delve into the issue, so we didn't know what to do. There weren't a lot of resources out there to figure out what to do, and so we really had to take our cues from the girls and figure out, what are they needing? Are there other underlying issues that we can address if they don't see marriage as a problem? And so that was important.
One other thing we're always very curious about is who individuals see as that person they can trust. You mentioned that a lot of them had kind of people at school they felt they could turn to. Were these teachers or like guidance counselor, or maybe someone that might not be in that authority role? We're always wanting to know who that first line of knowledge, where it may fall.
It's been different at every space we've worked in. At one of the schools, it was a social studies teacher who had lived in Mali and spoke Bambara, and even though she was working with a population that didn't really speak Bambara, the kids felt that she had they had a kinship with her, and so they would go to her to discuss things. They didn't really speak to her about marriage, mainly because I wasn't sure. I'm not sure they had the language to be able to explain what that was to her, but they went to her for lots of different issues. At another school was a male social worker, and he, for some reason, had a good connection. Had a really strong connection with these girls, and they really trusted him, and we grew to trust him, and he was just a really strong advocate in the school building for the school for what was at that time a small but growing really fast school population with West African kids. So
we've had the same experiences where it's people who they're talking after class with a teacher. They're forming some bond in some way, and then that's often the person that they're going to confide in, or just be comfortable approaching if there are any issues that arise from a future or an actual marriage that they're in. All right. Well, we can.
I have a question also, if I may. So these girls, since the girls are minors, right? How were they listed in the school system? Like, were parents still listed, within their files, or was the name of this male person listed? And
that's one of the challenges that we run into. Almost all of them were minors still. But even in New York City, at least, our experience has been, whether they're minors or not, they still follow the same protocols around who do you contact if there's an issue, who's the parent or guardian, even though there may not be a parent or guardian. So oftentimes the husband is listed as the parent or guardian, which for us is a bit problematic. Sometimes if the family is worried that they might get in trouble, the husband is listed as the parent or guardian on purpose. Other times the school just lists they need someone, and so they list the parent or guardian. Or for some other girls, they're married but their husband is still listed. Their parents are still listed as a parent or guardian. So it really depends, and I think that some of the inconsistencies that we've seen in the way that this is handled. What we've tried to work with our girls on, especially the ones that are 18 or over, is that they should have an option on who they list as their emergency contact. Because if you're having disciplinary issues in school, the husband may not be the most appropriate person to call. So we need to figure out who else can be that person that gets called as an emergency contact if your husband isn't the person you want contacted. Because often at times it's not an emergency, it's a disciplinary issue. And so that may or may not be the most appropriate. Sometimes that person is us. Sometimes it's they fall back on their parents or a sibling or something like that.
Is there as much choice if the girl is a minor? I mean,
no, there isn't any choice.
Is it normally the parents have to be listed?
It's whoever's listed as the guardian, yeah.
Okay, okay. But there have been circumstances where the husband's enlisted as the guardian?
Yes, either the husband presents as a guardian. So we have had girls that have registered to school. Somehow the husband is transferred as a guardian. They come in and they say, this is my uncle. And they register to school, so the husband is listed on the record as an uncle. But it's actually their husband.
Okay, great. Well, I want to give you a chance to talk about your report.
So going into this report, the purpose of the report was to inform. We felt like there needed to be some sort of policy or practice in place around this issue because, in large part, because we were getting cases of girls being forced into marriages that they were very clear that they did not want. And we had one particular case that's described in the report where we were turned away. A 15-year-old girl was turned away from Child and Family Services, or ACS, in New York because she was told she wasn't in any imminent danger. And so, you can see the kind of the story written out in the report, but she was eventually forced to go back home to her parents' home because ACS would not take the case, and so that was one of the reasons why we wanted to do this report. We knew that some policy was going to have to happen because these cases were happening more and more frequently, and we wanted to make sure that the policies that were crafted were informed by the experiences of our communities, just as we hope that other communities would also bring to the table their experiences. We knew that any policy that might be crafted, if it was limited to our communities, wouldn't be adequate to others, and vice versa. Policies crafted for other communities wouldn't necessarily serve our needs. So we wanted to kind of throw our hat in the ring and offer up our experiences in this work. So that's kind of what the purpose of the report was.
Can I just say thank you, because I think it is really key. This is an issue that touches many different communities, and it manifests itself in different ways.
Very different, yeah.
Exactly, and so we have particular experiences with different communities we're serving, and I will say at Tahare, many of the calls that we're getting are from young women who have a family background from the Middle East or from Central or South Asia, and we have worked with some clients from African communities, but oftentimes it's in a little bit different context.
Yeah.
So getting some further, more detailed information is, I think, helpful for anyone that's trying to work on this issue.
And it's also for us important to, even if what the answers look very different, just to know what questions to begin to ask.
Exactly.
And we hope that this will, anyone that's looking to kind of delve into this issue might gather some insight on how they begin to address it. So our methodology, just the technicalities around the research. So we used we collected three types of data. One, ethnography, and this part of the data came out of my dissertation research. My dissertation research was focused on education and the access to education for this particular population of youth. My research question did not involve marriage at all, but it was the one thing, as we talked about education, that came up over and over and over again. And one of the challenges girls said that they faced in trying to access education was the pressure to marry. And so it became one of the primary findings in my dissertation. And so through that ethnography, we did I did semi-structured interviews with 15 girls, and they collected diaries, and I conducted research with them over a school year. We also used participatory action research, where we had a few years ago, when we were just beginning to see this issue, we weren't sure how to begin to enter. And again, the way we tend to do stuff at Sauti Yetu is figure out kind of what is the community saying? What are they thinking? And so we asked a young woman who was interning with us, who herself was married very young, if she would be willing to, if we gave her some training, she'd be willing to do some focus groups for us. And so she began meeting with girls and just doing these kind of amateur, new we call them kind of new agey focus groups with girls in various schools that were already married. And we asked them, if you knew what you knew now, what would you share with your younger sister? What would you share with those coming behind you about marriage? Mm-hmm. What resources would you have wanted for yourself? And so those were mainly the questions we were asking. We weren't interrogating the fact that they were married. We were interrogating what they would have needed to better support them in making a decision that would be beneficial.
Mm-hmm. And it's kind of, in a way, like things they learned
along
the way. I'm so curious, how did you get participants in those groups? How were the groups advertised?
For that,
it can be tricky. You know what I mean? If you're going into
we didn't really advertise. We just what we did was we recruited from the youth that were in our program.
Okay.
For the participatory arts and research, not for the ethnography. The ethnography, I did my own recruiting for this, but for the PAR, we really we did kind of what's called a snowballing technique. So as we got one set of kids, they would invite other set of kids, they would invite another set of kids, and it kind of snowballed in that way, and that's how we collected participants. Great. We didn't do any kind of flyer. I'll be absolutely honest, it wasn't a piece of work I was giving much attention to at the time. We were trying to get the program off the ground. We had this young person who had this interest. We had this issue that was coming up, and we were like, we need to know more. And so she took an interest in it and ran with it.
That's awesome.
And so
it yielded
something. And so we just, I can't take too much credit for it. It was one of those things that was just kind of happening on the sideline, and then it became really useful later. And then we did a textual analysis of our case notes and our client demographics. And for all of our programs, we keep very detailed case notes. And so what we did was we pulled those case notes or those progress notes that were related direct that mentioned marriage or early enforced marriage. We pulled out any kind of identifying information, and we just coded them for different issues that we were trying to understand. And so that's the methodology behind the research. The participants ultimately across these three methods were 30 West African young women, ages 15 to 21. 15 were unmarried, 13 were married, one got married over the course of the research, and another had been married but was separated. And so, we need to stop for questions.
Okay. So I think we're pretty good for right now. Again, if anyone wants to submit questions, you can do it via the question tab. Thanks so much.
So just to get into New York City, because, again, our work is really focused on New York, because issues of marriage laws are often decided at the state level, and because child welfare issues are also state-level issues, our focus is New York State, and New York City in particular. So just I am not a lawyer, and so if I botch this royally, I'm sure someone will tell me. I hope someone will tell me. So right now, as the law stands in New York State, at 18 years or older, no consent is required to marry. At 16 or 17 years old, there must be written consent from both parents. At 14 or 15 years old, there needs to not only be the written consent from both parents, but also from a Supreme Court judge or a judge from family court. And at under 14, no marriage license can be issued. So while people often ask us, this is legal, the reality is that this very rarely comes into kind of any meaning for the girls that we.
Yeah, you'd mentioned that none of them had like a legal marriage in a court or in front of a judge or something like that. It sounds like they didn't even have a license.
No,
sometimes it was just a traditional.
It was a traditional marriage, and so. But what we've learned from our legal advocate, our new legal advocate, is that even though, actually I'll step back a bit. If many of our parents knew these laws, we probably We get a lot of traction, unfortunately, because there's a lot of ignorance of the laws around marriage. I think my concern would be if this information got out, we would see a lot of people taking their daughters to the courthouse to get married, because these laws are pretty much saying that your daughter can marry if they have your permission at 16 or 17. In our community, most of our girls are marrying and potentially at 15. So in our community, a lot of our girls are marrying at 15, 16, 17. So actually, if these laws were more widely known, we might see people take more advantage of the idea that they can go to a court
and get married.
In fact, with our girls, when we know the decision is made, it's going to happen. They're not resisting, and it's already kind of a done deal. We encourage them to get the marriage certificate, or right after the marriage has happened.
Well, because I think it does offer some protections.
It
if
does.
they're willing to go through with the marriage, and it's just being considered an early marriage, not a forced marriage, it can, provide legal protection they otherwise might not have if anything happened.
Exactly. So we tend to do that because we also work in communities where polygamy, in some of the communities we work in, polygamy occurs. And so if you are married to someone in traditional ceremony and that person files petitions for another wife to come from abroad, that wife is the wife on record. And so you're kind of left out in the cold. And so it's kind of one of those things where if you're going to do it, it behooves you to get a certificate.
We have a whole slew of questions coming in. I think people are very interested in this topic, so I just want to take a second to answer some of these. So we had a question around getting separated, and if that was an issue, if the girl was forced to marry. I don't know if with the separation you spoke about if that was a forced marriage or an early marriage or what the exact circumstances were.
That situation, if I'm remembering correctly, was an early marriage. She was, I believe she was around 15, and did not want didn't feel like she could resist the marriage. Went through with the marriage, and then realized that she didn't want to be in it anymore. Like she had regrets, and then she talked to family members and just refused to go back to her husband's home. She had threats of being put out of the house. She had threats of being disowned. Up to date, I don't think they've done that yet, but there was a lot of fear and a lot of threats, and she has definitely dealt with the isolation that comes with making that decision, and she hasn't gone back to school. So she's kind of on her own.
Another question that came through was just curiosity about the girl that got married during the study. Was she willing to get married?
She was. She invited me to the wedding, and was very happy about getting married.
Okay. So it seems like you're working with, again, both kind of early marriage situations as well as situations where someone doesn't feel like they have a choice.
Right. And there's a lot of, I think the easier, and I say easy, it's all relative, but the easier cases are when the girls have no ambivalence, when they're very sure they do not want a marriage. Most of our kids are extremely ambivalent, and they're wavering, and they're going back and forth, and they're weighing what their options are, and they're trying to, they're weighing a lot, and there's a lot on their shoulders in terms of what they're figuring out, how they go along or how they don't with this.
Another question that came through, a participant was asking, how old are the spouses that are marrying these girls? Is there like an average, or is it kind of all across the board?
I'd have to say I don't have numbers on this, but anecdotally, when we hear 10 years, we're like, sadly enough, like, okay, kind of relieved, because it can go higher. It can go up. We've seen cases of up to 30, 35-year differences. So 10 years seems to be kind of the average. And relative to the 35, 40, it's sometimes a relief, because at least they're in the same decade.
And another question that was asked was, and I don't know if we can all answer that here, but there was a question about if somebody was going to get married before a court, or getting a marriage license, and getting married, before a magistrate or any other type of legal official that can marry you. There was a question about how people obtain the girls' consent.
They don't.
Yeah, and I have to say that that's kind of our experience as well. We hear anecdotally all sorts of different stories about, sometimes the girl is so cowed, or the girl or boy who's being forced to get married, feels like they truly have no agency to speak. And if, the parents are accompanying them to the licensing office or to the ceremony, they don't think and are not given an opportunity to privately object to the marriage. And this is something we're trying to look at, I think, from the level of the kind of national group. Because this, no matter what culture you're from or background or what group you're working with or working in or are part of, that's just a legal issue that affects a lot of different people. And it's not giving the protections the law is supposed to. So.
And in New York, I mean, a lot of discretion is in the hands of the city clerk. And so that city clerk can deny the license based on any number of things, and one of those things can be consent. I have yet to hear of anyone deny a certificate, but in theory they can.
And another participant was asking if statutory rape laws were ever invoked or used, or if that's a concern.
I'm going to ask the lawyer's help in this.
Work that you're doing.
So what we've learned in child welfare and what we're learning in this is that marriage does not necessarily mean sex. You know what I'm saying? So there isn't an assumption that the marriage has to be consummated.
Okay.
So the several cases that we've brought and had turned away, we were told, well, because we thought we'd make the argument, and the advocate and the lawyer that we had with us thought we'd make the argument that, well, she's going to be forced to consummate this marriage if she gets married, and it's obviously against her will. While there are marital rape laws, it would have to almost be after the fact. She couldn't say, just by virtue of getting married, that it had to be consummated, and that would constitute some sort of forced sexual.
Was the goal to try to get like a protection order or some other kind of court intervention?
Oh, we were grasping for straws. I think we were desperate. We're a little more savvy than we were then.
But we've argued similar things.
Yeah.
That the marriage, there's a whole host of potential harms, and one of them is rape. If the marriage, if she's forced to.
I think that's why we've taken the tact of going through child welfare, because the laws around endangering the welfare of a child give us a lot more room than just laws of consent.
And have you had luck with the New York-based child welfare system?
We're just at the very beginning of starting the conversations, but we've had, I think, I'm being cautiously optimistic. I feel good. I feel like they've been very receptive to hearing us out. They've been receptive. I mean, they see the issues, and we get the referrals, and they know we get the referrals. I think we definitely have an in because we are a preventive services agency. I think had we been going in cold without a relationship, it would have been a little more difficult. But we have the cases to show. We have a plethora of cases to show. One, the harm that this causes. Two, what the harm that's caused by not having a policy in place, not having rules around this. So what that does, though, it kind of addresses the kids in reality that are under 17. I mean, ACS is often not taking cases. The kids can find themselves into care older than that, but it really is the 17. Our big issue, and why in this report we don't focus solely on kids under 18, is that the challenge for us are the kids that are actually 16 and above, because they're not. Some of them are adults, so we assume that once they're adults, this isn't an issue anymore, which is not the case. And I think that's where the domestic violence and the sexual assault community has to come in, because the elements of coercion and force are still there, even though this is no longer a child issue, issue with a child. So I think that's where the violence against women's movements needs to step in to this issue, because
I definitely agree.
So that level of coercion that you see in domestic violence, that we see in commercial sexual exploitation of children, all of that still exists in this situation. But for us, child welfare is kind of the beginning, because it's kind of your low-hanging fruit. Let's get at that first, and then hopefully we can begin to think about really how old do we want kids to really be married. I mean, I think the global community has already kind of decided that 18 is the age, but we as a country haven't come to that place yet. So I think that's a larger discussion to have.
No, I think we're all struggling with some of these questions around, should there be a minimum age of marriage, and how can we get government agencies like child welfare or child protection services, depending on what it's called and what state you're in, because we've had challenges around where we've brought cases to them, and they have, again, if that child is in the 16, 17 range, they don't see this as falling within their mandate, because technically with parental consent, this child can marry, and it becomes a very confusing issue, I think, for the child protection and child welfare workers.
Because they have a clear line of child endangerment, which is 18, but the law says something different.
And I think forced marriage is still something, it's not, they aren't quite seeing it as fitting in domestic violence or sexual assault. It's like this issue outside their normal mandate, and it can make it challenging.
In fact, I have a question about that, because in our experience here at TIRA, we've always been concerned about what the mandatory reporting can cause, if we were to approach the Department of Child Services, and especially in a population of girls that come from the Middle Eastern countries, and there's a lot of honor killing going on and a lot of different traditions in place. And so how, if any, have you dealt with this situation?
Since there is no policy in place, we technically have no mandated mandate in these cases, because when we do report, we report, but nothing happens. So what we've dealt with, we'll talk about this. Our hands are often tied if we don't find out early enough. And our community's honor killing isn't a practice that we've seen. So thankfully, that is not an issue that we deal with. But in terms of trying to figure out how to address this issue, and for younger children, if we have we have a very savvy preventive services director, and she's the director of our CFS program, and she knows the system inside and out, and knows how to kind of maneuver to get kids into what services that they need, and at the minimal interaction of the city, because again, we don't want to target families in ways that aren't helpful. But we're fortunate in that we've had to work a system that isn't really set up for us yet. Ideally, we can get the system set up in a way that we don't have to feel like we're constantly running the gauntlet just to get services to a kid and get access to support for a kid. But right now, we're fortunate enough that we have a preventive services director that is just really savvy and knows how to get access to things for our kids.
I think that's something that we're hoping, again, through the national network and the Forced Marriage Working Group, to start having these conversations, because I'd love to get Department of Health and Human Services involved in this, and have it actually be, a mandated issue that people are trained on and know better how to respond to. All right.
Well, but I think I'll just go back to that. But I think that's why the work coming from this space is really important, because if Health and Human Services gets a hold of this issue and carves out policy that doesn't, how will someone know that a marriage is about to happen? And we'll get into that later into this presentation. And our communities, knowing that a marriage is about to happen without putting all of the onus on the child to be the one to prove that it's about to happen, is a very delicate thing, because culturally it happens differently. So what looks like a marriage in our communities and even within our communities, looks so different across the different cultures and nationalities, looks very different in a Middle Eastern or an Arab or a Southeast Asian community. And so what the threshold of how do we make the case that a marriage is about to happen without having that child be, or corroborate this kid's story, without the whole entire case resting on their shoulders, is difficult. We don't, we thankfully don't, at least on paper, we're not putting all of the weight for a child that's a victim of abuse to make the case that they are, they don't have to be the only ones making the case that they've been abused. We have rules in place that kind of let us know that this is happening regardless of whether or not the child is able to come forward. And I think that's in part what's needed on this issue, except it's such a diverse.
Well, and it's so delicate, too, because oftentimes the pressure is coming from your parents, other family members, the greater community, and speaking out against them can just be a huge weight. And I understand why so many people are ambivalent in the community you're working with for other reasons, too, but I think that is definitely a factor. I want to give you time. We have a few questions coming up, but I'm going to let Ramatu get through a few more slides before we enter the next round of questions. I'm so glad everyone's so engaged on this topic.
So some of the child welfare issues, one of the cases that we've uncovered in New York that's been helpful for us, it really, again, addresses the issues of younger girls under 14 years old, is People versus Benue. And again, I'm not a lawyer, so if I botch this. But a New York court found that a father of a girl who was 13, who had arranged for his daughter to marry a 17-year-old young man, and he made his home available for the ceremony. He found someone to solemnize the marriage. He gave them money, and because he was actively participating in his daughter's marriage, he was found guilty of child endangerment. So there is some case law, and I'm sure there are others that can speak to this a little bit better.
But very
little case law.
Because we've researched it here in Virginia and the D.C. area and Maryland, and yeah, there's very few court decisions that speak at all to issues of early or forced marriage.
And the thing we need to pay attention to is that if we focus on the legal aspects of marriage, we really miss the boat and how it really happens. And what the meaning is. And so for us, what we've seen in our community is that the ways the marriages are solemnized tend to be either elder family members, so it's not always religious. It can be simply, the families come together, the elder family members come together, decide that the families are coming together through this marriage, and the marriage is a marriage now. It may be religious leaders. We've had community leaders that are, they'll be asked to officiate over a wedding, mainly because they're someone that's well known in the community and they're well respected. We've had folks that are married in absentia of one or more parties, which, strangely, I've seen that happens in my community for sure. If the families are all abroad and everyone's here, then the families can do the marriage and send you a videotape or send you a CD of the marriage. The marriage has happened, but it's abroad because that's where everyone is.
And is that, in those circumstances, would the young woman, would she be aware that this was being planned, but she might not know it's actually happened until?
Most of the time, when we've seen it happen, and the few times we've seen it happen, they know that it's happening, the marriage is happening. They may have a party here. So I'll get an invitation to a party. But the actual ceremony happens where all of the family members is, or oftentimes it happens that way because the person that she's supposed to marry is abroad, and she's here, and maybe the families can't afford to pay for the trip back, so they'll do the marriage abroad, and then they'll do some sort of party here, and then she's married.
Okay.
And again, there's very rarely any marriage certificates.
And when these marriages are done through these kind of, not what I think most people would see as official sources, and when the marriages are ones that haven't been documented by a marriage certificate, but they are, accepted by the community, are there protections for these girls, in terms of the marriages? We had a few questions around that, too, just asking, for example, if there's an issue that comes up later and there is interest in getting a separation or a divorce or something, can they get property? What about children?
I think as long as what we've seen in the courts in our domestic violence program and our violence against women and girls program is that as long as she can show that there was some sort of common law marriage and that can document the marriage in any way, that the marriage is recognized by the court.
Okay, and so they are accessing the courts then
for the divorce.
Dissolution of the marriage.
Exactly.
That's not done kind of unofficially in the community. Okay.
But we have had girls who've gotten married, then they want the divorce, and they really put a lot more weight on the unofficial, traditional way of getting out of the marriage. And we often have to make the case to them, but you also have to, especially if you have to petition for your spouse to come here. And oftentimes the petitioning for the spouse to come here is not done by the girl at all. The family takes care of it. So she doesn't have any hand in that petition. And so we have to say to the girl, but you also have to do this. And I learned this when I was here for a working group meeting a while back, where we were like, if you do it abroad, you can kind of act like it didn't happen. But no, that's not true. You can actually, you actually have to act like it happened because it can come back.
Yeah, it's really important, I think, too, just to return the power to the girl so that she's the one that's in charge of whether the spouse is coming here or not. Things can't be done without her consent, and that's a concern.
And so for a lot of our girls who just kind of want to forget about it, once they've kind of said they want to be done with it, they want to put it behind them, but we've learned that we have to do that. We've had to do that. Just in terms of early marriage trends that we see in our communities, so polygamy adds a different layer onto the marriage because we have to understand where the girl is placed. and often in the household, and that often depends on why the family wants to marry her. So if they want her to get married because she's acting out and they're worried about her behavior, it's more likely in our experience that she will be a wife further down the line. So she might be a second, third, or fourth wife because there's either a rush to get her married or somehow she seems devalued in some way. The age difference in the marriage, that is substantial. The 10 years is generally what we're seeing is probably about average for us, and then with some extremes. The marriage here and abroad, we talked about that. The implications for the extended family members if the marriage is unsuccessful. We often tell our girls, please tell us early, because once the ball starts rolling, even if the parents are amenable to pulling it back, they often feel like their hands are as tied as their daughter's hands are. They feel like they can't. There's been a lot of discussions happening. An elder has done this. There's been preparations made. There's been money exchanged in terms of dowry or anything like that, and they feel as locked into it as the girl feels.
So it's really, it sounds like it's a kind of extended family community decision.
Oh, absolutely, absolutely. This is not
very hard, for people to get out of.
And so this is the tough part about figuring out how to deal with this issue in a criminal justice way, because it's not a parent is a perpetrator, the child is a victim type scenario.
It's more complicated than that.
It's a lot more complicated than that. Oftentimes, girls that are married young have very little support, especially our unaccompanied youth. I think that we tend to see youth that come unaccompanied or come to join a friend of the family because they have an opportunity to come and they end up staying with that friend of the family. They are often pushed into marriage because they're not, they tend to feel like more of a financial burden. We also find that kids that are coming to join to reunite with their families that they've had long separations from, either because the parents came abroad to work and then they were back home being raised by other family members. When they come here as teenagers, that adjustment, that reunification, that adjustment into the household can be very conflicted and very contentious. And we see a lot of marriage on both ends. For the girl saying, I just have to get out of this situation. Marriage is the best way for me to get out of it. And for the family to say, well, it's too much trouble in the household. Maybe she should get married. Yeah. And where there's a polygamous family and maybe the girl has come to join a family, a father's second or third wife, she may not be welcome in the home, and so marriage is an option to deal with the situation. So we tend to get the intervention. If we don't get the intervention at the school, because we often get the hospital is probably the next common place that we get referrals from, because they tend to end up, our girls tend to have children very soon after getting married. And that's the goal. The goal is to get pregnant. So when we have girls that are going abroad to get married and they've been forced into going abroad to get married, the family will try to keep them there as long as they can so they can get pregnant. And so the idea is to get pregnant as soon as possible. So if the goal is to get pregnant as soon as possible, a lot of the intervention can happen at the hospital.
Because that's maybe the first time they've had a chance to talk to somebody outside the family or the community.
Exactly.
It sounds like you have a great relationship with, again, different hospitals and staff and people that know to turn to your organization and give referrals.
Yeah, we've been fortunate in terms of we've had at some of the hospitals that tend to work with our community. We've been very good about getting some good relationships built.
That's great.
Children very early on, and they oftentimes, if they're under 18, they may have met the spouse, and the family will do kind of a courting process where she's told you need to, especially if they've arranged the marriage. Okay, now this is time for you to talk to them on the phone. So maybe 6 months before the marriage, they'll get a cell phone or a phone card, and every week they're asked to talk to the person that they're going to marry over the phone. And so that is often a sign that a marriage, one, is going to happen, and two, it's just kind of sometimes the way it begins.
I just want to take a quick pause because we've gotten a few more questions, and just to note to people, we will be sending out the PowerPoint after the presentation, so I hope you're taking notes, but you don't have to worry about capturing absolutely everything on the slides. Two questions that came across recently. One was going back to this age of marriage issue. A participant was noting that, the only countries that haven't yet ratified the Convention on the Rights of the Child are the USA and Somalia, which establishes the age of 18 as an age for marriage. And she was wondering if there's value in advocating in the U.S. to ratify the treaty. It's, that question, in a way, it's kind of hard to answer. I think that, of course, advocating for any kind of treaty that's going to be advancing, human rights across the board is a good thing. But we have an incredibly complex system here in the United States, and the notion of having state control over age of marriage and over, things that are seen as kind of private matters, it's not going to have any impact on state law if we do ratify this treaty at the federal level. Unfortunately, I think sometimes the U.S. doesn't follow even different international agreements that we have signed to the letter. So I think it's a great thing to advocate for, but I think there's some more kind of on-the-ground things that we can do to better protect and to serve individuals that are facing marriage at a young age or are facing situations where they don't feel like they have a choice. One thing that another person was asking about, another participant, was just trying to have a varied view in looking at how these cases present themselves and trying to remember that there are oftentimes victims in these cases. And she was asking in particular about what has been the response, actually, from courts and from different human welfare service agencies that you've worked with. Have they tried to kind of maybe push this aside as being a cultural issue they don't want to interfere in, or are they, willing to try to do whatever they can and seeing this as falling within their mandate?
Yeah, I think what we've been challenged with in our work with child welfare is the kind of an extreme form of cultural sensitivity that isn't really helpful. So we've had we have a couple cases one case that I have in mind right now is we had a young woman who was trafficked here to work to help, as a nanny. She brought here to work as a nanny, and she was kind of passed from family to family to be served as a nanny. She was never paid. She was brought here with the promise that she'd be able to go to school, and she was never enrolled in school. So she, I think at the age of 15 or 16, she was married. We don't know if she was pushed into the marriage by the folks that were trafficking her or if she decided to go into the marriage as a way to get out of the trafficking situation. We're not sure. She came to ACS's, or our the New York State Child Welfare Agency, their attention at the hospital because she gave birth. And the case was flagged as a sexual abuse case. However, they left her in the home. And we said if this was a U.S.-born child born in New York City who was 15 and wanted to live with her boyfriend and left home, and she was living with a man, I think he was like 47, and she wanted to live with a 47-year-old man, child welfare would remove her from that home and put her in care. But because it was a marriage, it was seen as different for some reason, and all of a sudden they kept her there. She stayed, and to this day she's still in the home. And then eventually she kind of aged out. She got to 17, and then they kind of said, well, there's not much we can do. And then they dropped it. But they had her case since she was 15. And so it's where our services are culturally specific, and we would never tell folks that they shouldn't be culturally competent. However, your role as a child welfare agency is still to protect children. And in this case, regardless of how she entered into the relationship, she was still a minor the case was indicated for child sexual abuse. So you had already made the designated as a sexual abuse case. Then she should have been removed. There shouldn't have been any other.
And they were just completely deferential.
They
should not have been.
They were deferential in a way that they should not have been. And by the time we got to her, she had shut down completely. Had the intervention happened when it should have happened, we might have been able to work with her and talk with her in a way that would have been supportive of her. Instead, she remains to this day in the home, and we still don't know a lot about what happened.
No, we see the same thing. It's like for so many of these youth that are in these situations, it's like unless they feel like someone is listening to them, believing in them, explaining choices that are available to them, and willing to act on that, they begin to feel just completely defeated, and it can make timing really critical on these cases.
And we have to remember what we're asking kids to do when we say to walk away from these marriages. You're saying to them, walk away from your family, walk away from your community, walk away from all of that in the context of a country that is completely new to you. You may not speak the language, you may not have access to education and services, and so to tell that to a young person and then to have them go live in a shelter, which isn't often the best place to be, is really difficult thing to ask them to do. And so, that timing is really key in it being able to support a young woman. And if you're having other folks that are in her ear making a different case, and there's nothing that you can offer that's concrete, she's not going to take you up on your offer.
And she might just decide it's more stable to just go through with it.
Right. So in New York City, again, there's beyond the work that the really great work that Tahrir has done around prevalence nationally. In New York City, there isn't a sense of what there isn't a data really on the prevalence of forced marriage and how prevalent it is. What we do know is that New York City, for our communities, is home to the largest population of African immigrants in the country. These numbers, the census data is on the screen. It's very low. Extremely low, because I think I might not know all of these people. So I'm convinced it's low. Of the youth, as we said, I think this says 30%. It's a little bit higher. As we've been doing this work, girls have been disclosing more and more. It's not something that we ask at the onset. We've begun to ask it in our intake, but it wasn't something at the very beginning of the program that we asked girls. We let them disclose. And then we know that in our communities, the three of the world's hotspots for child marriage are growing communities in New York. So Guinea, Mali, Burkina Faso, these are all communities that are growing very quickly. Gambia, in New York City.
I think I had done a little bit further analysis into the study that we did, trying to see how many cases were reported in New York. And if I remember correctly, please don't quote me on this, anyone out there in the call, I'd have to double check. But I think of the 3,000 known or suspected cases that were reported through Tahrir's 2011 national survey, I think it was around approximately 300 came from respondents that were located in New York State, which is 10% of the overall total. So obviously there's a pretty significant chunk, and this is, again, amongst diverse communities and diverse respondents. But I think because New York has so many different populations, it does represent a place where this is definitely happening, not infrequently.
So in terms of kind of how we get to this place, from this report, from the girl and from our work, the decision that is made around why and how a girl is married, or either married early or forced into a marriage, on the community or the family end, stability is secured for the future of the child and the grandchildren. One of the girls in the study who married and was very happy that she married said that I have to make sure my children are taken care of, and I can't be someone out here who has children that aren't cared for. And marriage, in her mind, ensured that would happen. And second is the prevention of any behavior that might embarrass the family, which is big. And then the other thing, especially marriage, and our executive director, Zainab, reminds me of this on a regular basis. Marriage is not about just two people in our communities. It is the way that you forge relationships, lifelong, generation-long relationships with other families. And so, and the decision to marry is often in that vein. And so those relationships are really important to people. And that's often why the decision is made. And then for parents, for the adults, it's securing support in their old age. If you can make sure that your daughter is provided for, then it means that she's able to provide for you in your old age. It's, kind of a very traditional form of Social Security. For our girls, stability and a secure future. New York City is a very tough place to live. And it's a very insecure place to live, and especially because of the fact that our population, a lot are struggling academically, struggling with literacy. The fear of being pushed out of high school and being out on your own in a city that's a very tough place to be is scary. And so marriage provides some semblance of stability. Increased stature in the family and community. I always joke with the girls, until I had my daughter, I was still a child. I had my daughter when I was 34. And until you are married or have a child in our communities, you're still a child. Until you pass that threshold into womanhood, you are a child. And so that increased stature is very attractive to a 15 and 16-year-old girl, to say you're now going to be a woman in the eyes of your community. Like seriously, like people didn't invite me to cook at events because I was still a child. You don't invite the child to, contribute to events, and I'm in my 30s. Peer pressure. We often see that girls that get married, we see them happen in groups, and they're often friends, and they're all kind of pressuring each other, and they come to school with the albums and show the pictures of the wedding, and they have the henna, and they get their friends as attendants, and they all dress up and take pictures. And if you put yourself in the mindset of a 15 and 16-year-old, that is really a lot of fun, and that is often very attractive. A lot of our girls argue that we've seen it, increased freedom of movement, especially if you have a girl that's of marrying age in your culture, she is under complete surveillance at all times. So if she goes to the store, someone's looking. If she goes to school, who is she talking to? Who is she standing next to? Where is she going? How is she behaving? That's constantly being reported back and forth. And especially in a setting, in these new settings where parents are very afraid for their children, period. I mean, they're in cities that are just really difficult, and the girls report that when they're married, they at least can come and go, for the time being, a lot more freely than they could than before. They don't understand that sometimes that changes, but oftentimes they're right. They have a lot more freedom of movement as a married woman than they do as a daughter in their parents' home. They stay in good graces as a community, and when you follow the rules of, at least in our communities, when you follow the rules, at least for the time being, you have access to an extensive community of support. You have people that will help support you when you have a naming ceremony for your child. They'll support your wedding. They'll support, you can borrow money here and there for little things. You have access to a whole network of support that if you don't follow the rules, you may lose. And so that is a pressing thing in their mind. The girls will say, well, who's going to help me here if I don't go along with this? Who's going to help me take care of myself and take care of my family?
I did have one question about the preventing behaviors that might embarrass the family. Mm-hmm. If you could just give some examples of what those are.
So it could be everything from how you dress to being seen talking to boys to actually having a boyfriend to mm-hmm. being sexually active. Mm-hmm. We say to the girls, which is unfortunate, but we say to them, if you are trying to stay in the good graces of your family and we've managed to convince the family to postpone a marriage, you better be on your best behavior. And that's sad. We have to tell them that, but we know that if they're committed to staying in their family's good graces, and the way that they've been able to delay the marriage is to stay in their good graces, the last thing they want to do is to do anything that's to rock the boat. Especially if we're just buying time. None of the girls said they never want to be married. We mm-hmm. haven't had any girls say that to us. There's still a very strong value for marriage. Mm-hmm. They just want to postpone it. Mm-hmm. And if your idea is to postpone it, you almost have to avoid behaviors that's going to raise the question of why isn't she married again. Mm-hmm. And it's not only for the parents, because the parents may be committed, but if other community members are coming to talk to them about their daughter and to complain about their daughter and to say how their daughter's being embarrassing, that puts added pressure on the parents mm-hmm. to go forward with a marriage.
Mm-hmm. Thanks.
So what we've seen is that families often make the initial choice of a potential spouse. Sometimes the girl has a say, sometimes she doesn't. And we've had very few cases where the girl can choose her own spouse as long as he fits the parameters, and then the family can reject that spouse or not. I think we've talked about the next slide, so we can go to the next one. Okay. And so what I would just want to also touch base on is that when we're thinking about this issue, it's not the same as looking at child marriage in a global context, because immigration changes things. So the threat of Americanization, in quotes, adds more incentive. So that puts added pressure on parents. The fact that these decisions are not just made everyone in the same compound or everyone in the same town or same village. These decisions are being made, one family member in Canada, another one in France, another one in Guinea, another one here in the States, another one, and they're all having these discussions on the phone about the marriage of their daughter. And so these questions, these issues, these decisions are made transnationally, and so if you're trying to prevent it, you can't just focus on the nuclear family that's in the same city that's walking distance from your office. You have to look at this in the global way that it's happening. And then marriage can be used as an immigration tool. So oftentimes the girls are used to marry someone that they're, especially if they're documented in any way. They either have a green card or they're a U.S. citizen. They're used to petition for another either family member or an extended family member, and so the choice of the spouse depends on who they're trying to bring over. And then poverty complicates the decision of marry. So if you're, especially in New York, we know housing is an issue. If you're a family of 7 living in a 2-bedroom apartment and you have this teenage girl that needs privacy and needs space and all of these other things, it puts an added layer of pressure on the family in terms of marriage. So just talk about risk factors. We talked a little bit about each of these, so I'll just touch on them quickly. The country of origin, the date of arrival, so how soon when did they arrive, because that often might be, they might have arrived just to marry someone, and so that's often important. Urban versus rural, so where are they coming from? So there are countries that are on the list as hotspots, but then if you're in a more urban environments, they don't tend to marry young, but you're in more rural environments, they tend to.
So you have to look at where they're coming from within the country.
Within the country,
okay.
And the ethnic group. The level of acculturation is big. We find that if you're on either extreme of acculturation, either you become very westernized, very kind of acclimated to here, or you're very isolated from U.S. culture and you're only in your community, you're a target. If you're isolated from U.S. culture and you're completely isolated in your community, you're more likely to marry early. But also if you're seen as taking on ideals that are completely foreign to your family, that puts an added layer too. So any extreme puts you at higher risk. The family history. So if the mother was married very young, very early, you'll tend to see that. If the mother was forced, you'll tend to see that. If there's little support or community connection, unaccompanied youth are big targets, at least in our communities. Pattern of behavior problems, lack of concrete future plans. If the girls themselves have a very idealized view of marriage, if I go into marriage, I'm going to be free. If I get married, I'll have my own home. If all of these things that the girl has in her mind about what marriage is,
we see that very often, too, in the populations we
yeah.
work with. That's how it's sold to the young women that are affected, that this is going to give you that freedom. You're going to have a new house, maybe a car, a cell phone, different
and you can go to school. That's the big thing. And the reality is, in a lot of our communities, I mean, most of the girls drop out, but a lot of them are beginning to stay in school after getting married. But because the pressure is to have a child immediately, that's a done deal pretty much. Because then it's saying, okay, you now really need to transition to adulthood, and going to high school is about childhood, and now you're an adult.
So oftentimes our promise is made that they'd be able to continue their education beyond high school, but then it doesn't really. And
it doesn't turn out that way. And again, because of the academic needs that a lot of our students face, they need a lot more time in school. They need a lot more time in school than what the traditional 4 years and 4 years of college. And then we talked about the economic status of the household. So in terms of our response, we have to start with what the girls want, because anything we do outside of that is not going to work if she's not on board. So they often tell us that they want education. That's the first thing. I want to go to school. I want to go to school. Postponed marriage. They don't want not to marry. They just want to postpone it. They want some level of independence, of what they call freedom, what they say is freedom. But they also want family and community approval. They want to be a member of their community. They want that approval. And like all of us working women, women of the day, modern women, we want it all. And the girls want it all. They want to be married. They want to have school. They want to have a career. They want to have children. And they want it now. And so, or sometimes they don't want it now, but someone wants it now for them. And so that's what they want. We talked a little bit about where do they go for help: teachers, family allies, youth organizations, hospitals.
Family allies, is that like just other people associated with the family, extended family members? One
of the first things we always ask is, who's your ally? Who's an ally in the community? Who's your ally in the family? Who do you talk to and that you can trust? Who has your father's ear or your mother's ear? Because it's not always the father that's the driving force behind them. So who has their ear? Who do they listen to? That's who you want to influence. So it might be an elder sibling, it might be a grandparent, it might be a parent, and who in the family is the people that are making these decisions? Who are they listening to? That might be the place to start in terms of preventing.
Because it's interesting. I mean, I think there are a lot of different approaches to this question in particular. If there's one thing actually that maybe creates great debate in the forced marriage advocacy community is whether to view family, other family members or family allies or, you know, people with connections to the family or the extended family as people that can potentially be used to advocate for the person. Or, you know, I know, for example, in the UK, like their forced marriage units guidance says do not engage with the family at all. So, again, I think there's differing approaches depending on the community, depending on the circumstances.
Yeah, we would never speak for another community. For us, family allies have been essential because we can often, if we can get enough of a consensus going on in the extended family, especially because this is happening so transnationally, there are people coming with different points of view based on where they're living, and they, you know, and oftentimes we can get a hold put on it, or at least get enough of the discussion going, because culturally, and a very important thing culturally, I think across a lot of African cultures is consensus, right? And building, you know, harmony and consensus. And so the idea, if you have several of the important decision makers in the family not quite at peace with the decision, it keeps the conversation going. And so sometimes that can buy time, if we're trying to buy time. But again, I would never insist that say that's across the board for any family. And if we also do a risk assessment and an assessment of kind of the level of danger that the girl is in, and sometimes that is not an option. We've had several cases where there's a lot of physical abuse involved, and so that is not something we would do in that case. Most of our cases, the coercion and the force is not physical. It is ongoing, nonstop pressure. And so when that's the case, there are times when it's appropriate to find out who that ally is. Now, we're very careful with that. We don't go jump in and say, these are our plans, and lay it out on the table. We have to feel that person out. We got to talk to them. We might go sit in the home. We might share a meal and kind of get a sense to feel them out. So it's not a, you know, across-the-board thing, but I think we have found in more cases than not that there's someone in the family that can at least drop another opinion in the ear of the decision makers, and sometimes that's helpful.
And it sounds like, I know from trainings I've done with you before, that you have different strategies for approaching that person. Like you said, there could be another reason why you'd be engaging with the family or engaging with this young person, so it doesn't set up a flag that maybe they're planning on opposing a marriage.
Right. So we might come in and say, you know, because we do academic support, so we might call in a family member, we might go do a home visit and say, you know, she's doing so well in school, and we wanted to talk to you about her college plans. And, you know, this is what she's doing, and we've been planning this for her, and wouldn't it be great if she became a lawyer, or, you know, and that may, but it starts to plant, like, maybe there's another option.
No, it's a great way of framing it.
And we can say to them, okay, well, what are your plans for her? How can we be helpful? It does, so we don't necessarily go to the table saying, hey, we're here, you're about to marry her, and we're, you know, we're here to say that if you don't do it, we're calling the police, and the police wouldn't really do anything anyway, but we'll call them. You know, that doesn't. And the reality is, there's no laws or practices or policies in place. So we could go to a family and make all kinds of threats, but none of them can pan out. And so we're at a deficit here. So we kind of have to be a little bit more strategic about how we approach it.
Thanks.
So the other thing we do is look beyond the marriage, because sometimes the reason why the girl is going forward with the marriage is a whole host of other issues. Is it housing? Is it immigration? Is it I don't have my papers, I don't know if I can get my papers, so I have to go along with this? Is it an education issue? Is it an issue of family conflict that needs to be addressed, and maybe we can address the family conflict, and then there won't be so we try to look beyond the marriage and figure out what is the underlying issue, if there is any, that might relieve the pressure. We get this a lot. So we do trainings, and we get very well-intentioned, wonderful people that approach girls, and they find this out, and then especially if they're 18, and say, well, I'm going to help you get out, and we're going to help you get out, and we're going to do all of these things. And I think oftentimes the family relationships, I think we underestimate the importance of family relationships to the girls, and the importance of being in their family's good graces. And so if you jump ahead of dealing with that reality, she goes back. She goes back inevitably, and she ends up either giving in or having to deal with the marriage. So you have to deal with that, the sadness and the process of coming to the realization that you're not going to be in your family's good graces. That is a long process. I have kids that I've been working with for 5 years and have resisted the marriage all this time, but are still mourning that that idea of being a good daughter to their family. Or still mourning that. I mean, I think in the last week I've had at least 2 conversations with girls around that. And it's a painful thing. And it's a constant pressure to say, well, maybe I should just go and make them happy. If I just do this one thing, it will make them happy, and then I'll be in their good graces again. And it seems like such an easy thing to do, to be in their good graces. And that pressure, I think, is probably on the list of the biggest pressures that the girls are facing.
We see the same thing, and I think we end up engaging with people in a way much longer with cases we see through the forced marriage initiative than our other types of cases sometimes, and in much more of a just supportive way than, say, a legal representation way, because that decision to leave is so hard, or the decision to not go through with the marriage and the implications from that.
Yeah. So I'm going to skip the youth, the community, because we've talked a bit about that.
Okay.
So the other thing that, as an educator, I feel like I always have to hit home is education. I think where we see that the one thing that we have seen is a very strong correlation, where our girls feel like they have prospects for the future. They have a plan in place. They know what's next. They are less likely to succumb to pressures to marry, a lot less likely. And it's also the parents are less likely to pressure them if they see that there is a path to something else. So I think that's important to note. I think the last few slides are kind of in the ways that we kind of figure out if a girl is going to be married and she's not disclosing. So if there's a travel date to the country of origin set at a really odd time, that's often a sign that something's about to happen. There's a change in the family dynamic. Either a new wife has joined the family, more children have come into the family, someone has lost their job. There's just something else that's going on. An older daughter gets married. There's any change in the family dynamic might raise up this issue. Wishful statements again, if you were married. So if the girl is here, and we always tell the girls, once they start talking about, well, if you're married, we wouldn't have these problems. If you were married, you wouldn't be talking back. If you were married, I wouldn't have to sign all these forms for school. If you were married, you weren't. All of these things are signs that something is going to maybe happening. A sudden interest in the girl's appearance and what she looks like. Beginning to buy and collect expensive cloths. A lot of our girls who didn't know they were about to get married and find out when they get home, it's often when we look back, these are some of the things that they saw.
The warning signs.
The warning signs that something was about to happen. They were encouraged to communicate with an older man really frequently.
So maybe they weren't being told that this was because of marriage was being planned, but
we
just have to talk to
and it's odd because I'll say to a girl, like, well, what did you think you were talking to him for? And she's like, I don't know. And, they can be very innocent. And so they're not thinking about this. And so sometimes they're talking to someone that they find out later to be their husband and they didn't know. A change in income. Sometimes the families will pass on whatever the bride price is to the girl and say, this is from your fiance. And so there you see the girls with a lot of money all of a sudden. We have in some of the communities that we work in, we see that as a practice. And so they'll have a lot of money all of a sudden. And then it tends to let us know that there's a marriage.
Could you let us know a little bit more about bride price? Because I think people are sometimes more familiar with the term dowry, which is...
Yeah, I don't know why I use bride price. That's actually, I don't know. It's something I think because the price is utilized across we work in West African communities, extremely diverse, and so it's used very differently across different communities. So in some communities, it's merely just a gesture. It's not even an amount that's any kind of substance. It's just a gesture to say, I offer this for something you're giving, something important that you're giving to me. You're giving me your daughter, which is important. Let me, So there's that. In some communities, it's very just ceremonial. In other communities, it is a substantive amount of money that's exchanged over years, even sometimes since from the time the girl was born. In other communities, it's done at this point that the terms of the marriage are being negotiated, and it's done to solidify that we've negotiated these terms and our families are now bonded. Once that money exchanges hands, it is difficult to turn back. So because then, especially if it's a marriage that's happened, that's been planned, it's been long in the planning, a lot of the parents are like, even if I want it out, where do I come up with this money now to return to these people? And the shame and the damage to my name that's going to happen when I back out of this. So other things to keep in mind is that she may not know that she's about to get married. If she does know, she may not tell you, and she may already be married and keeping it a secret. So when you're doing your intakes and asking questions, these are things to keep in mind.
How do you, if you're concerned someone's married and keeping it a secret, what kind of questions do you guys ask, or do you just try to build a rapport? And
I'm again, woefully, our social workers would probably do things differently. But since I'm not, I just say, are you married? And if they're not, and then I ask their friends. And then I say, okay, well, I'm going to come to your house and visit. And because hospitality is really important, it's very rare that they're going to say no. So say, I want to come see you. I want to meet your family. And so we just schedule a visit if we suspect, just and then I'll say, if you're married, you can tell us. Like, it doesn't, one, there's not a lot we can do. The reality is we can't force you out of the marriage. We can't go take you out unless you're under a certain age. And even then, we have to get ACS on board, so that takes some time. So if you're 16 and above, there's nothing really we can do. We want to know for your well-being because there's a lot of other things that we want to be able to make sure to take care of with you. We want to make sure that you're thinking about family planning, that you've had a doctor's appointment since you've gotten married, since you've gotten pregnant, since you've gotten married. We want to make sure that you have a plan for continuing your education. We want to make sure that you're still engaging with girls your age, you're still joining clubs, you're still thinking about college, you still have plans for your future, there's a whole list of other things outside of the marriage that we want to make sure we address with you. So we want to know, not only because we want to keep you out of the marriage, but we want to make sure that you're okay. And so that's why we kind of tend to prod and push around it.
Well, it's great. I mean, those kind of holistic supports are hugely important instead of just focusing on this one thing that they're going through.
Right, because the marriage passes and then there's a lot left to deal with. Because all the reasons why we don't want them to marry, we still have to deal with them. We still have to deal with the possibility of dropping out of school and the health consequences and the social consequences and the socioeconomic consequences, and can she still get a job? All of those things have to be dealt with, whether the marriage happens or not. And so in terms of future work, and we hope that as we publish this report and word is getting out around New York State around this, that the next step is going to be some sort of child welfare policy around this. But then after that phase, we really we need to take this work into our communities and start having the conversations with the families. We feel, though, there needs to be something in place that when we open the floodgates for girls to say, hey, I don't want to get married, that there are actually resources and something in place for them.
And remedies. Standards.
Exactly. And so we want to do the policy work first. For us, it has to be culturally specific. We definitely don't aim to do this work for any other community but our own in terms of how we intervene. In terms of policy, we hope it'll have a ripple effect, have an effect in all communities. But when we say all communities, we mean if at some point, by some miracle, the age of marriage, consent to marry, is raised to 18 in New York, then that affects all children. Like that is a good thing for all children because we've made a clear distinction about what we think childhood should be and what's important. So I think that's important. Targeted resources and opportunities. There needs to be resources, especially for the older girls. There needs to be a place for them to go if they decide to leave. There needs to be help with them in terms of their residency status. There needs to be help for them in terms of education. There needs to be resources in place for those kids that are not the more clear-cut cases. And for us, the big thing that we're hoping will come out of this is more community-specific data collection. We hope that other communities that are seeing this as an issue begin to collect their own data and talk about how this is happening in their communities.
Great.
And so that's where we'll leave it.
Well, we have a few more questions.
Okay.
We still have a little bit of time that I definitely like to just chat about. Thanks for everyone that's been submitting them. We had a few questions about the health implications of forced and early marriage that participants were wondering if you could touch on that, what you're seeing in your community.
What we're seeing is, because I work in the youth program, the health implications tend to come to our Violence Against Women and Girls program and our CFS program, our Child and Family Services program. And the reason why I say that is that when the girls are with us, at least because our program is still relatively young, we're 7 years old, they're still in the honeymoon phases while they're still with us. And so everything is wonderful and great. We know that in our Child and Family Services program and our Violence Against Women and Girls program, we've been seeing that if women come up HIV positive, they tend to come up, don't find out until they have their first child. So what we're going into our data now, we're going into all of our case files now, and we're beginning to document at what age were these young women married and what were they, what age were they married, how old was their spouse, when did they have their first child. We're also interested in if they're presenting issues of domestic violence, and any kind of engagement with the child welfare system, and if there was any health consequences. So we're still collecting that data, but in terms of my work, I can't necessarily speak to health. What we've been seeing is the girls having children very young. So we see higher rates of premature labor. A lot of our girls go into labor early, way early. We see them having cesareans, high rates of cesarean in our girls that are pregnant, and oftentimes the first time that they go to the doctor on their own is when they find out they're pregnant. So whatever health issues may have been neglected from
they
their
may be learning that all at the same time.
They're learning all of that at the same time.
Yeah, learning about the pregnancy. Thanks, I think that's very clarifying. Another question that was asked was, we talked a little bit about the cultural sensitivity being an impediment for Department of Children, or Family Services workers, or child welfare agencies. Have you ever engaged with law enforcement on this issue, and has that also, what kind of response have you gotten in, when you've tried to bring this issue to the attention of law enforcement, say if it was a case where there was a high degree of violence or a risk to the person and they needed to have some kind of law enforcement intervention? Has that happened?
We have in a very small handful of cases. Again, I would not say that cultural sensitivity is an impediment. I think cultural sensitivity in a vacuum is an impediment.
Yeah.
So cultural sensitivity for the sake of it and not with an eye on the protection of the young person is a problem, not cultural sensitivity by itself.
Yeah, no, of course.
I just want to make sure I definitely didn't want that to be the walk away, the takeaway from this. But what we've been able to do, I think where law enforcement has been helpful, we've been able to if there is violence, most of the time the young people don't want to report. But what we've been able to do is even if there is violence and they don't want to report, what we ask them to do is to come and let us take pictures of it, so it's documented. And so if later on there's more violence, we're able to get an order of protection and to substantiate that. So we've actually, where we have had very rare occasion to use law enforcement, but when we have, it's been okay. Yeah, it's been okay.
One final question. A couple of participants wrote in saying how they really do understand how the breaking of the community bonds and the displacement from the family and the community can be really one of the most difficult things for individuals that are trying to leave a forced marriage or considering not going through with the marriage that's being pushed on them. And so my question is, how are you recreating this? Is there any way that you've found with the girls that you've been working with in the last 7 years that you've been able to get them new communities or support, or are they finding each other? And this is definitely something that I know we here at Tahare, as well as advocates around the country, are struggling with.
I think what we've been able to do is we definitely tell the girls, and I tell them personally, when they come to us and they're in a situation, we go through the possibilities and what we can and can't do. And we in fact, I'm waiting for a call from a girl now. We had the conversation and I said, okay, I can't promise you that it's going to be easy, and I can't promise that it's not going to be really hard sometimes. What we promise is that we will be there with you from the beginning to whenever you tell us you don't want to see us anymore. And when we say that, we mean it. So we've had youth that have been with us for 5-6 years. They are our community. When we have a chance, we hire them. We have events. They come. They've stayed at our houses. They babysit my daughter. I think as an agency, because we started out so small, we've had the opportunity to really build very close connections. And I think one thing that girls know about us is that they know we're a safe place to be, and they know we care. They know we care, and they know that if there's anything that we can do, any rule we can bend, any way that we can maneuver the system on their behalf, we do it, and we've done it. And so to that end, we try to be that community. I think we've been relatively successful with that.
I think you guys have been hugely successful.
No, I'm hoping. I'm sure there may be folks that might say otherwise, but I think we call them our girls, and we mean that like they're our kids. However, we also want them to build community with other girls, and that, I think, has been an evolving piece of our work. At the very beginning, we found that the girls felt there's a lot of distrust. I mean, if you're in a situation where people are constantly watching your movements, you're concerned about gossip. Gossip is extremely powerful. The girls are very weary of each other, and who might say what and where and how. And so I think, we over the years, we definitely feel that the girls are connected to each other, and they look out for each other, and they come to us and say, so-and-so is in trouble. Can you help them? So I think that's an evolving piece of work, and I think we've done good work around it, but I think it happens over time, and I think you kind of have to show and prove, and I think you also have to, not promise more than you can do, and we try to let the girls know that it's not a lot out there right now in terms of support for you. We will do whatever we can, but bottom line is that we'll be with you. We'll attend every appointment. We'll go to every doctor. We'll go to every lawyer. We'll go with you. Someone from the agency will go with you.
No, I mean, I really think Sauti Yetu has an amazing model of support and engaging in, again, both preventative as well as all these other programmatic, work that you guys are doing to really just be an incredible pillar for the community. And I hope we have a lot of different, and I know there are a lot of different organizations and different communities around the U.S. doing the same thing, and I think yours is really a model. So as you can see on the screen, if there's any follow-up questions or comments, you can contact Dr. Bangura directly. Thank you so much to everyone that joined in today's presentation.
Thank you all for your interest and your care about this issue. It's really exciting to know that there are a community of people around the country that care so much about this and are wanting to learn more. So thank you.
And, I just want to comment again, this is part of a quarterly series. We're so excited to have partners like Sauti Yetu able to come down and join us. If you're interested in becoming an even more vested part of the community that's developing here in the United States that's dealing with the issue of forced marriage, I would definitely encourage you to go to Tahari's website and to sign up for the National Network to Prevent Forced Marriage, as well as our quarterly forced marriage newsletter. That is the vehicle through which we try to let people know about webinars like this, about trainings. I know Sauti Yetu just did an outstanding, was it a four-part?
Four-part.
Four-part in-person training in New York for area agencies, government officials, service providers, attorneys on the issue of forced marriage and how they're dealing with it in the communities that you're working with. And we try to publicize all of that and just create a forum between communities, amongst advocates, hopefully with the government, which is something we're pushing for right now, to improve protections and to raise awareness about this issue in the United States. So thank you so much again for your time and for joining us. And I look forward to hopefully seeing most of you at our next webinar, which I'm anticipating will be probably late April, early May, and we'll very likely look at the issue of immigration issues related to forced marriage situations. So thank you so much again, and feel free to email either Dr. Bangura or myself if you have any questions. And we will also be sending out the PowerPoint from this shortly.